Ben. Um, Barbara Walter, our speaker today, is the Rohr Professor of International Relations at UCSD School of Global Policy and Strategy. She has been educated in political science with a BA from Bucknell and an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. She then completed postdoctoral fellowships at the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies at Harvard and the War and Peace Institute at Columbia. She joined the UCSD faculty in 1996 at the Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, which has now been renamed to the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Our own EA administrator, Vanya, has recently taken one of her graduate level courses and tells me that Barbara is a wonderful teacher. She co-founded with Erica Chenoweth the award-winning blog Political Violence at a Glance, which has won from the International Study Association the most promising blog of the year in 2013, the best group blog of the year in 2014, and the best post of the year in both of those years. Her scholarly activities and awards have consisted of her service on editorial boards of the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and International Studies Quarterly. She's received awards from the National Science Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Guggenheim, and the United States Institute of Peace, and finally the Smith Richardson Foundation. She's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. As a member of the Political Instability Task Force, which is a US government-supported advisory group, she's studied and written about civil wars and insurrections for the last 3 decades. Her very timely recent book, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, has resulted in numerous speaking engagements and interviews on national television. I'm grateful that she's found time to speak with us in spite of her packed schedule. Let's talk about civil wars. We need you to unmute, I think.
Yes, thank you, Alan, for that very kind introduction. I don't know how many people have read the book. I'm going to assume that most of you have not. So I'll give you a little backstory on it. As Alan told you, I have been studying civil wars for the past 30 years. All of my research until recently has been on civil wars that have occurred outside the United States. So I know a lot about places like Iraq and Syria, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Mozambique, Northern Ireland, Israel. And then 5 years ago, I was asked to join this task force called the Political Instability Task Force, and it's actually run by the CIA. And the goal of the task force is to come up with a predictive model that will help the U.S. government predict where around the world political instability and violence is likely to break out. And so I was asked to join in 2017. We meet about 4 times a year. And the task force is really comprised of 2 types of people. Half the task force are people like me. They're academics, political scientists, economists, sociologists, anthropologists, anybody who knows a lot about civil wars. And the other half of the task force are data analysts whose jobs are with the agency itself. And what we often did, or what we did especially in the early years, is we would sit around and we would talk about what the academic studies had to say about the risk factors of civil war. And we eventually compiled a list of over 30 different factors that different studies had found to be potentially correlated with the outbreak of civil war. And it included things like poverty, income inequality, how ethnically and religiously diverse a country was. But it included a lot of other things like whether a country had a lot of what we called rough terrain, mountains, swamps, things that made it hard for a government to potentially police its territory. And we handed this list over to the data analysts, and they took these factors and they played around with them to find out which created the most parsimonious model. And they found that, in fact, only two factors were highly predictive, and they were two factors that surprised even the experts. If you had asked us which we thought were going to be the most important factors, we would not have said it was going to be these two. The first factor is something that we call anocracies. Anocracies are just a fancy political science term for partial democracies. It's governments that are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic. There's something in between. So think about a country like Singapore. Singapore holds elections all the time. In fact, it has an incredibly high turnout rate. For reasons I don't entirely understand, Singapore citizens are incredibly enthusiastic about voting. But the outcome is essentially preordained. The same party wins every single election. But you could also think of a country where they do hold elections. The outcome is not foreordained. But those elections are free, but maybe not entirely fair. There's some meddling in the elections from one party or another, or from the incumbent, him or herself. So this first factor ended up being more important than anything else. And political scientists talk a lot about why this is the case. We know that there's a correlation between anocracy and the outbreak of civil war, but we don't know why that's the case. We strongly suspect that it has something to do with state capacity. It's not partial democracy per se. It's not the features of democracy per se that's making these governments or these countries at high risk of civil war. But we think that a partial democracy tends to be a proxy for governments that are weak. They tend to be in transition, and in fact, governments that are transitioning from one type of political system to another are especially at risk of civil war. So these partial democracies, we think, usually have leadership that's being contested. It has new leaders, new governments that don't necessarily have the full trust of the population. You're having new leaders coming into power and making changes to institutions, and those institutions are weak. So those are all of the theories that academics are playing with to try to figure out what it is about anocracy that makes them prone to violence. But we do certainly know that those are the types of governments that tend to experience violence. The second factor is something that we call factionalism. And factionalism is another sort of fancy political science term for countries whose populations have organized themselves politically around identity. So they formed political parties not around any ideas or any specific political ideology, but they form political parties based on ethnicity, religion, or race. And so, just to give you a real-world example of this, think about the former Yugoslavia. When the Soviet Union began to collapse in 1989, 1990, Yugoslavia and Yugoslav citizens suddenly had the ability to form whatever type of government they wanted. And they very quickly determined that they wanted to create a democracy, and they very quickly organized competitive elections. You had these old-time communist party members. Slobodan Milosevic was a tried and true communist party member. He had held power during the Soviet era because he was a good party apparatnik. And he suddenly saw that the situation had changed and that if he wanted to continue to maintain power, to hold power, he was going to have to compete in elections. But he also knew that if he competed as a communist, he would never win. Yugoslavs didn't like communists, and they knew that Milosevic was a communist. And so, being very strategic and very savvy, Milosevic figured out that he did have an advantage. Milosevic was a Serb, and the largest ethnic group in the former Yugoslavia was Serbs. And so he very quickly formed a party around Serb identity, and he began preaching consistently via state radio and state television this idea that Serbs had to stick together during this period of transition. Serbs had to vote for a Serb leader, and if they didn't do this, then the Croats were going to vote for a Croat leader, and if that Croat leader won, that Croat was going to throw Serbs out of their jobs, throw them out of the military, and potentially kill them, as some Croats had done during World War II. This turned out to be an incredibly effective strategy, and Milosevic came to power. And then you started to see Yugoslavia break apart. And of course, Slobodan Milosevic didn't want this to happen. He wanted to be the leader of all of Yugoslavia, not just the leader of a smaller rump Yugoslavia. And he then initiated a war to try to retain first Slovenia, and then Croatia, and then Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that is a sort of a classic example of a country that very quickly went from essentially being an authoritarian regime to an anocracy, and at the same time you had the emergence of these very nationalistic ethnic political parties, and it didn't take long for war to break out. So here I am. I'm sitting 4 times a year. I'm sitting in a conference room in suburban Virginia with a lot of really smart people, and we're talking about countries in Africa, and we're talking about countries in the Middle East, and we're talking about countries in East Asia, and we never, ever, ever talk about the United States. And that's because the CIA legally is not allowed to study the United States or discuss it in any way. But I'm a private citizen, and I'm a scholar, and I know that we have all of this information about the risk factors of civil wars. And I'm watching what's happening here in the United States, and I start to see that these two factors are emerging here in the United States, and they're actually emerging much more rapidly than anyone actually had anticipated or many people even knew. And so just to give you a sense of what I was seeing as I was on the task force and before I wrote the book, in 2016, the U.S. democracy was downgraded. The measure that we use, or the data set that we use on the task force, is called the Polity data set. And the Polity data set is produced by a nonprofit in Virginia called the Center for Systemic Peace. And the Center for Systemic Peace, every year, it gives a grade to every single country around the world. And it essentially grades the government on a 21-point scale, going from -10 to +10. -10 is, if you get a -10, you are considered the most autocratic type of government. There are only 3 governments in the world that today have a -10, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and North Korea. You do not want to be a -10. On the other side of the scale are countries that get a +10. +10 that's where the world's most liberal democracies sit. So think about Denmark, Switzerland, Canada. They are all positive 10s. The United States for many, many years was a positive 10. Most Americans probably, if you ask them, they would probably still tell you, oh, the United States is an incredibly, strong democracy. Well, in 2016, the Center for Systemic Peace downgraded the U.S.'s democracy from a positive 10 to a positive 8. And it did that for a lot of reasons, but one of the important reasons was because international election monitors who were here in 2016 to monitor our election, they deemed it free but not entirely fair. And they didn't think the election was entirely fair because they found both partisan meddling at the local level, and they also understood that our intelligence agencies had detected Russian meddling, attempts to meddle in the election via social media. And so our democracy was downgraded. The Center for Systemic Peace downgraded our democracy again in 2019 from a positive 8 to a positive 7. And it did this because the executive branch of government, the White House, refused to comply with requests for information and refused to comply with subpoenas that were handed down from the legislative branch. Now, that might not seem like a very big deal, but it actually is, because the way our founding fathers designed our democracy was through a system of checks and balances. And one of the things that they really worried about was a runaway executive. They worried that the president would concentrate power in his hands and eventually become a king. And so they designed Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, to be the main check on presidential behavior. And they were able to do this through, for example, the impeachment process. And so when in 2019 we had a president who simply ignored all of these requests, that indicated that the executive branch had in fact become much more powerful than the legislative branch, and that check on executive power was no longer operating fully. And then by the end of 2020, by December of 2020, the Center for Systemic Peace downgraded the U.S.'s democracy to a positive 5. A positive 5 puts a country in the anocracy zone. So in December of 2020, the United States, by this particular measure, became an anocracy, and when that happened, it lost its label as the world's longest standing democracy. Switzerland now has that honor. So I'm watching this happen. I know that civil wars almost never happen in full democracies. They almost never happen in full autocracies. They tend to happen in the middle zone. And the United States had, in December of 2020, entered the middle zone. Then I'm thinking about the second factor, this factionalization. And America's political parties have become racially and religiously factionalized. If you think about, for example, the Republican Party, it used to be that white Americans were almost equally divided between the Democrats and the Republicans. But in 2008, that began to change when the white working class, whose ideological home had traditionally been with the Democrats tended to pursue economic policies that were more economic and social policies more aligned with working class voters. Those white working class voters began to gravitate towards the Republican Party, to the point where today the Republican Party is 80% white overwhelmingly evangelical Christian in a country that is multi-religious and multi-ethnic. And if you look at the Democratic Party, the vast majority of African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Muslims, atheists, Jews vote for the Democratic Party. And so you see this racial and religious split politically. If the task force were allowed to study the United States, it would have put the United States, it would have considered the United States at high risk. High risk is if you have these two features. It would have considered the United States at high risk of civil war by December of 2020. It would have put it on a watch list. We actually called it the watch list, and we would have handed that watch list to the White House, which is something that we do every year. So here I am. I have this information. I know what we're talking about on the task force. I see what's happening in the United States. And that's what really motivated me to write this book. I thought it was imperative that the American population and our politicians understood that this is the risk that we're taking by allowing our democracy to weaken, by injecting identity into our political parties, and something needed to be done about that. There's another thing that we know, and when I say we, it's scholars who study civil war. We actually have a fairly good idea of who starts these civil wars. And again, it's not who you would expect. Most people, I think, if you were to ask them, what types of groups do you think initiate political violence? I think they would say, maybe the poorest groups in society, or the groups that are most heavily discriminated against, or perhaps even immigrants are the ones that start civil wars, and that actually is not true. The groups that tend to start civil wars, especially ethnically based civil wars, are groups that political scientists call sons of the soil. Sons of the soil start civil wars, and sons of the soil are groups that had once been politically dominant, but have either lost their political power or their political power is in decline. So here you could think about the Muslims of southern Mindanao. Southern Mindanao was a heavily Muslim area. When the Philippines became independent, successive governments in Manila began pursuing policies of encouraging Catholics in the northern part of the Philippines to emigrate to the southern Philippines. The north was overpopulated, whereas the south was sparsely populated. The south was also rich with lots of resources, including rich land and rich minerals. And the governments in Manila also, I think, hoped to sort of gain greater control over the Muslims in that area. And so they created various incentives for Catholics to move south. Catholics moved south in droves to the point where most regions in Mindanao became minority Muslim. And the Muslims started to see their land being taken away. They started to see the best government jobs being given to Catholic settlers, and they became very resentful. And they organized and eventually started a civil war. And that civil war actually continues today. It's been over 30 years. So you see this again and again and again, that the groups who organize, have the capacity to organize, have the motivation to organize, are the groups who feel that their country is being taken from them, that they are the rightful heirs to the country, that they deserve to rule because they have always ruled. And these groups are the ones that get this deep sense of resentment And the resentment they will often articulate as resentment at their loss of status. And I think if you think here in the United States, for those of you who watched videos of January 6th, when the Capitol was attacked, one of the really striking things about those videos is the impunity by which these insurrectionists, if you want to call them that, walked down the mall. They were walking down the mall. They were taking videos of themselves. They were posting those videos online for everybody to see. They clearly did not think that they were doing anything illegal. They really believed that they were patriots, that they were taking the country back, that they were saving the country. And this is sort of classic sons of the soil behavior. So again, I'm watching this as well, and I was just like, this fits the pattern that we have seen in hundreds of cases around the world over decades. People ask me, are we on the precipice of civil war? The fact that the task force would have put the U.S. on the watch list in December of 2020, does that mean war is imminent? And the short answer is no, it doesn't. We know that countries that have these two features are at about a 4% annual risk of civil war. And that sounds quite small, but it's actually not. What it means is that every year that a country continues to have those two features, so every year that a country continues to be an anocracy and its political parties are organized around race, religion, or ethnicity, the risk increases. It's very similar to smoking. If I start smoking today, the chance that I die of lung cancer or another smoking related disease is quite low, at least in the short term. But if I continue to smoke for 10, 20, 50 years, the likelihood that I eventually die of something related to smoking becomes quite high. And it's the same with these two features. People also ask me, why is this happening now? Why is America's democracy declining now? Why are we seeing the rise of these, religiously and racially based parties, or more generally the rise of ethnic nationalism? And I think my hunch is that there's two answers. I have a whole chapter in the book devoted to social media. I call it an accelerant. Right now, we don't have hard evidence proving that there is in fact a correlation between social media and, for example, the decline of democracy or the rise of far-right parties. But I suspect that if companies like Facebook or YouTube were ever forced to release their data, and scholars were actually able to analyze the full range of data that they have, that we would very quickly see that a correlation does exist. And in fact, last December, when Frances Haugen, who was the Facebook whistleblower, when she delivered tens of thousands of pages of internal Facebook documents to the Wall Street Journal and to Congress and testified to Congress, her testimony very clearly stated that Facebook had done its own internal studies, that those studies had found a correlation between social media use and a whole series of negative societal outcomes, including an increase in violence, and that the reason why Facebook didn't want to release this data is that it didn't want to be held accountable for that. If you think about, for example, the decline of democracy, it is very, very odd that after almost 100 years of rising democracy around the world, it ended in 2006, and it didn't just end in fledgling democracies like Hungary. For the first time ever, we have been watching democratic backsliding in some of the world's most liberal democracies. The United States, as I told you, declined, but so did the UK. There have been, by different measures, done by another nonprofit in Sweden called the Varieties of Democracy Project. They found democratic declines in countries such as Sweden, Iceland, countries that previously nobody thought we would see a decline. What happened in 2006? I think, one, we saw the rise of social media, but more importantly, we saw social media companies begin to become more savvy about their recommendation engines. And they started to keep as long as possible by bringing in a lot of psychologists and behavioralists, and they they communicated that what tends to keep people's brains engaged tends to be more negative information, information that tends to trigger the fight or flight response, that tends to trigger emotions of anger, hatred. So it's the more incendiary material that not only holds people on their devices longer, but also tends to get shared at a much, much higher rate than information that's, that tends to produce, less frightening emotions and fearful emotions. And so, one of the things that happened was these recommendation engines began preferencing that material, giving it broader reach than less incendiary material. And I think one of the reasons why we started to see attacks on democracy gaining leverage, why we started to see a rise in hate crimes, a rise in ethno-nationalism, is it suddenly had this forum where it could blossom. But why? There's a second reason, and this is a really, really important reason, and I touched on it in the book, but there wasn't enough space to go into greater detail. But the second reason I think this is happening now in the United States is because we are in the midst of this great transformation, where the U.S. is going from a country whose population is majority white to a country whose population is going to be majority non-white. And that transformation is going to take place between now and around 2045. The United States will be the first white majority country to go through this transformation, but all of the other countries are going to follow us. Canada will be next, followed by Australia and New Zealand, and then eventually by the countries in Europe as well. So the U.S. is this great model. It's going to be the test case for how a white majority country and democracy can transition demographically, and do that in a way that is both peaceful and that maintains our democracy. And so I think what happened is in 2014, a U.S. census showed for the very first time that a majority of babies in the United States were non-white. And this actually sent the far right and the white power movement in this country into a tailspin. Prior to that, they had placed a lot of their emphasis on immigration, trying to halt immigration, especially illegal immigration, which tended to be non-white immigration. And what this 2014 census told them was that they could be entirely successful in halting all immigration And it still would not prevent this demographic transition. And that's when you started to see the rise of violent extremist groups in the far right. People like the Proud Boys, or the Three Percenters, groups that we call accelerationists. Accelerationists are groups who want to accelerate. They want to accelerate the emergence of a civil war, because they don't think there is time to wait to reform through conventional political means, and they don't think there's time because we now have a majority of the babies who are non-white, and so if you had watched videos, for example, of the Charlottesville rally in 2017, when you had all those most of them were young men holding torches and chanting. One of the chants that they were saying was, "It's the birth rate, it's the birth rate, it's the birth rate." And they usually follow that with, "We will not be replaced, we will not be replaced, we will not be replaced." And so I think one of the reasons why we're seeing this here in the United States today is because it's becoming increasingly clear to extremists within the white population that they are losing their dominant political position, that in a healthy liberal democracy where one person has one vote, they will increasingly no longer be able to win those elections. And if they do believe that it is their right to continue to rule in this country, then the only way to maintain that power will be extra legally, and many of them believe they'll do this by inciting a civil war. So I want to leave you with hope, though. I don't want this to be entirely depressing and terrifying. And I do actually think there is hope. And again, the fact that we know what the factors are that increase the risk of civil war is enormous. It's enormous. The fact that if you have those two features, the annual risk is quite low means that we have time. If you know what the factors are and you have time, you can do something to change it. And so I actually think one of the most important things that we as Americans can do is simply to realize that a second civil war actually can happen here, to take this seriously. This second Civil War is not going to look like the first Civil War. I think one of the reasons why many Americans have a hard time even conceptualizing the possibility of a second Civil War is because they're thinking of the 1860s version of a Civil War. But that is not going to happen here. It's going to look like, if it happens, it's going to look like a 21st century version of a Civil War, which is really more of an insurgency. It's going to be decentralized. It's probably going to be fought by multiple different militias spread across the country, and they're not going to engage the U.S. military directly. In fact, they're going to do everything possible to try to evade the U.S. military. And so they're going to use unconventional tactics like guerrilla warfare, hit and run attacks, and they're going to use terrorism directed at civilians, directed at opposition leaders, directed by civil servants who are like liberal judges who are viewed as being in cahoots with the federal government. That's what a second civil war is going to look like. So I think the first thing that we can all do is just take this threat seriously, and realize that we can't be complacent about our democratic decline. We do have to do something about it, or else we will be increasingly in dangerous territory. And then, the second thing, of course, is to strengthen our weakened democracy. It's clear right now that this is not going to come from our own politicians. Republican leaders have no interest in reforming our democracy. In fact, they are going in the opposite direction, where they're taking a whole series of measures to try to cement in minority rule. And we now know that Democratic leaders, even when they have control of all three branches of at least the White House and the House and the Senate, they don't have the votes to push through reform. So it's not going to come from the top down, which means that it's going to have to come from the bottom up. And the way I think that we can do that is through voting. The 2020 elections had historically high turnout, and and still I think it was something like 80 million Americans did not vote. So there's a whole lot of Americans who are standing on the sidelines, and if we could convince those people to have their voices heard, I do think we would see a different makeup in the Senate and in the House, and I think that could potentially allow for reforms to be instituted. The third thing we can do is to deal with the problem of social media. Every other form of media is regulated in this country. Social media should be regulated as well. And I think over the next 5 years, we're going to start to see more and more evidence of its negative effects. And I really, really hope that our politicians will have the courage to push through regulation. I don't advocate limiting freedom of speech. I say let everybody put whatever they want on social media, but freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach. And what the recommendation engines are doing is they're taking the most hate-filled information and they're pushing that out disproportionately, and that sort of megaphone is what we should regulate. And then the last thing is, we should take identity out of politics. An America whose democracy is strong and whose political parties reach across racial and religious lines is going to be an America that's peaceful and that thrives. And until we do that, people like me and people who study civil wars are going to be watching the United States, and we're going to be worried for it. So we know what we have to do. We know the factors that put us at risk, and we have time to do something about it. Thank you.
Professor Walters, that was an incredible presentation. Thank you so very much. We already have a question in the chat. I'd like to go ahead and open it up to Jake Jacoby to ask you directly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you for a very stimulating discussion. I was wondering, I have a couple questions. First, can you comment on why civil wars, once they start, seem to last so long? You described a 30-year war. And clearly, so much seems to relate to the territory and whether there's a relationship between the territory where the revolutionaries are and whether it's defensible or not. And I think that probably, maybe I'm answering my own question, but that seems to be an aspect of why the Ukrainians could not overcome the Russian separatists.
Yeah.
But when you look at Transnistria, where they became independent and actually have elections and elected their own president, yet nobody recognizes it as a separate country, how in fact, is that in fact an anti-democratic response for some reason?
Yeah, so it's so funny you asked this question, because my very first book was on why are civil wars so hard to end. And at the time I wrote this in the early 1990s, sort of the conventional wisdom was that once civil wars start, they're going to last a long time because, clearly if people are fighting within the same country, these groups hate each other. They're always going to hate each other, and they're never going to want to live together. The Serbs and the Croats, you can't get them to work together. And I didn't think this was the case, because civil wars also happen in countries that are ethnically and religiously homogeneous. And the studies that have all tried to look at ethnic and religious diversity, it didn't find any correlation between, more ethnically diverse countries and more civil war. And so I studied, I studied, all the civil, there's been over 200 civil wars since 1946, and I studied all of them. And what became clear is that there's a very specific reason they last so long. And let me take a step back. If you look at interstate wars, so wars between countries, think about Russia and Ukraine, or think about, Germany versus, Russia, or France and Britain. About 70% of interstate wars end in a negotiated settlement. About 70%. About 70% of civil wars end in decisive military victories for one side or the other. So they have completely opposite ways of ending. Interstate wars end in negotiated settlements. Civil wars are fought to the death. So why is this the case? Well, it turns out that there's another thing that's different between the two types of civil wars. In wars between different countries, if they sign a negotiated settlement, what they do is they take their armies and they retreat back to their territories, and they'll fortify their borders, and they have the ability to protect themselves from any future attack, right? In a civil war, every single peace agreement that has been attempted in a civil war asks for the same thing. One or both sides, but usually the rebel side, is required to disarm, demobilize, and disband their military. So the rebels, once they sign an agreement, basically, one of the terms is always, yeah, but you have to disband your military, send your soldiers back to their villages, give up their arms, and you have to trust that the government isn't going to use this opportunity to launch a surprise attack and basically crush you in a way that they couldn't crush you when you were fully armed. And so what ends up happening is that peace negotiations are often attempted. And in a majority of the cases, they actually draw up a peace deal with all the terms of what they want and what they're going to trade. And then the rebels realize that they're going to have to make themselves completely vulnerable, and they stand up and they walk out, and they refuse. And they make the decision that it's better for them to keep fighting, because at least then they have the ability to provide some self-defense, rather than to basically give up their arms and suffer whatever consequences might happen. And so so that's why civil wars tend to last a really, really long time.
All right, question from Joshua Ferrer. Joshua, unmute yourself. He may have problems with his speaker. I will read his question. Our democracy is by design undemocratic in that the Senate and Electoral College are not majority rule institutions.
Yeah.
This is probably what is holding the country together, in that the rural conservatives always have a chance. Do you wish to comment on that?
I completely agree. The U.S. has all of these unique, archaic, undemocratic features that are the result of compromises made, in large part for southern states and slavery, that puts our democracy at particular risk, that makes it particularly vulnerable to democratic backsliding, and that makes it fairly easy to exploit if you wanted to craft and cement minority rule. We already have it in the Senate, and and if you look at other strong liberal democracies that were crafted long after ours was, if you look at Denmark and Switzerland, for example, none of them have these features. It's such a unfortunate vestige of our past. The other thing that we know is that civil wars in countries with democratic features tend to usually happen in democracies that are based on majoritarian rule. They don't tend to happen in parliamentary systems. And so, here we also have a democracy which is winner take all, with a very powerful executive, where the president is also commander in chief of the military. I mean, all of these features, make our democracy particularly vulnerable to slipping back into authoritarianism.
Indeed. Question from Gail Liu. What comments do you have regarding the way voting rights are trying to be manipulated now?
Listen, this is an example of the Republican Party still trying to work within the system. I guess maybe that's hopeful, but really not. So let's say if you're the Republican leadership, you now know that if you're going to double down on representing basically just the white Christian population in the United States, you now know that you will not have the votes to win elections. So this is where you are in the game. You can choose to continue to compete fairly and accept defeat and accept that your prominence in the political system is going to decline, or you can try to use the power that you currently have to manipulate the system in ways that will cement in your rule long after you've lost the majority. And that's exactly what they're doing right now by making it more difficult to vote rather than easier to vote, by purging voter rolls, by instituting voter ID laws, by continuing, for example, to have off-cycle elections. There's a whole series of things that are not illegal, but that are very, very undemocratic, and clearly benefit one group in society over other groups in society. And the Republican leadership is in the process of doing this. And I guess, maybe that's better than what the accelerationists are trying to do, which is they don't want to work within the system at all. They just want to go straight to civil war. But this is a very, very conscious strategy to lock in power while they have it, so that they maintain control long after they deserve to, based on demographics.
We are fortunate to be in your seminar today. Ron Campnell, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, could you talk about ranked voting and how that might affect particularly primaries? Maybe I've heard discussion that might help moderate extremism in the primaries. And then have you given any thought to what, worst case scenario? We keep hearing more and more about the efforts at different levels to overturn the election, moving it to the state legislatures, declaring martial law. What if some of those events had actually happened? Have you given thought about what the backlash might be?
Well, I mean, I'll take that second question first, and maybe I know Peter Gurevich is in the audience, and maybe I'll punt the first question to him. But the second question, again, putting in party loyalists at the local level in charge of elections to ensure that they would, call their their election for the Republican Party is simply another part of that strategy. Yes, that is allowed in our system. The norm is not to do that. But if you put in party loyalists who are willing to do that, that would be a way to win elections, even if you don't have enough votes. How would the American public react? I think, I think it would fall along party lines. I think Republicans voters would, for the most part, be supportive of it, and it's not necessarily because they're bad people or that they're undemocratic. It really, I think, has a lot to do with our news sources. They're getting their news from a set of sources that is telling them that there is large amounts of fraud in elections. That's telling them, that the Democrats are double voting, or that they're putting, fake names on the voter rolls, and so they, there's a whole propaganda machine that is in place to support what the Republican leadership is doing, and to convince Republican voters that this is legitimate and that this is absolutely the way to go, and this is what is best for America. And it's this propaganda machine, and that is not just via Fox News on television, but it's through local media stations, which are now essentially controlled by the Sinclair Group, which is very, very conservative, and also through media personalities, online. So they're getting a consistent message, and then of course the recommendation engines just are feeding them more of that information, and the more they click on it, the more extreme that information becomes. And then regarding ranked choice voting, it is being tried, and my sense is that it will make it more difficult for extreme candidates to get elected, but that is now beyond my area of expertise. But I bet Peter Gurevich knows a whole lot more about this than I do. Peter, do you want to step in?
Barbara, you're doing a great job. You do not need me at all.
And you're enhancing the discussion, Peter, enhancing it.
I mean, I like ranked choice voting, but it will solve some problems, but it won't do anything about gerrymandering, which is a far more severe and worse problem. And it won't do anything about it. We've got to get the Supreme Court to get off its butt and do something about gerrymandering and recognize the sanctity of the right to vote, which it doesn't do anything. Barbara, you're doing a great job. You do not need me. I have nothing to say.
Yeah, I agree that gerrymandering is the primary problem. San Diego is considering ranked choice. I don't know if you saw some recent articles in the paper. They're considering it. It seems like the voter suppression is one level, but overturning elections or sending it to and dominated legislature next step that could potentially happen. That was, I think we were pretty close to that happening. That's a major concern I have in upcoming elections.
I agree.
It's going to be not just suppression, but the next step beyond that, if they're still not satisfied with the results, is these Republican dominated legislatures will overturn. By the way, it was in the news in terms of gerrymandering. The Supreme Court, I think it was in New York State, has rejected the New York Supreme Court, not the U.S. Supreme Court, rejected the Democrat proposal for redistricting. So that's going to cause some problems.
Yeah.
Another question for the chat.
Thank you.
From Professor Richard Moore. I'm curious about your current relationship with the CIA Committee on Civil Wars. I understand that the committee cannot discuss the U.S., but you are a member. You have learned a lot from your work on that committee, and you now discuss the U.S. in your book.
I am no longer a member. I am no longer serving on that task force. So that allows me to spread the word.
All right, very good. What does our government do in response to identifying the countries on your watch list?
What do we do? I have no idea. I don't know.
Okay. Next question from Professor Jordan. Your brief projection of what an American Civil War might look like suggests the sides would be Proud Boys alike against the more democratic government. What if the government itself is dominated by, say, a president or party inclined to support the rebels?
Well, that's a possibility. And in fact, in December, there was that really powerful op-ed in the Washington Post written by 3 former generals who made the argument, that even if there was a Democratic president in the White House and a war did break out, that they believed the U.S. military would break along partisan lines. And so this notion that, rebel forces or insurgents wouldn't have a chance against the U.S. military because the U.S. military is so strong, that might not actually be true if the U.S. military splinters and becomes much weaker and divided as a result. But I actually think the war will be taken directly to civilians. You'll see, and Michigan's a great example where it's kind of a hotbed of militia activity. It's a deeply divided state along rural-urban lines, or along racial lines, along religious lines. Rural Michigan is almost entirely white and Christian, and urban Michigan is almost entirely majority non-white. And so if you're a white supremacist, and oftentimes they're also anti-federal government, so they don't like being part of being under the rule of the federal government. They much rather be under the rule of their own state government. You can imagine a militia like that in Michigan saying, we don't care about what happens in Washington, D.C. All we want is a white ethno state. We want Michigan to be white. We want our own state government, that we're going to rule ourselves. We want everybody else to leave us alone. And you can imagine that they could actually accomplish that, or they'll try to accomplish that, by targeting minorities, African American churches, synagogues, placing bombs there, targeting judges in Detroit who are not sympathetic to the cause, assassinating them, and basically engaging in a reign of terror designed to intimidate that population, but also to chase them out of the state, so that they eventually leave and move somewhere else in the United States, in a form of ethnic cleansing, so that Michigan then does end up, in fact, being almost entirely white. And then, the question is, well, how's the federal government going to respond to that? And I of course, I think they would go in, but if this happened in a number of states and they were using guerrilla warfare, it wouldn't be that easy. And there was an enormous amount of sympathy in the local population, and this would not be something that would be that easy to eliminate.
Professor Walter, at the end of your presentation, you ended on somewhat of a hopeful note, but what you just described is sort of the subject of my nightmares, because I believe that the transformation of the U.S. from majority white to minority white, that demographic transition is in fact taking a stranglehold on our government and our populace. And I don't feel as hopeful. Can you talk me off?
Well, I think here we can talk about California. We all live in California, I believe, right? California went through this transition already. We are, we are a white minority state, And we went through a rocky period with Pete Wilson, right? You guys remember that, where Pete Wilson began to pursue these very, very vindictive policies against illegal immigrants. And that succeeded for him. That galvanized many whites in California. It gave him support. It brought him to power. But it didn't last, and that's because he alienated the Latino population here. And as the Latino population grew, they remembered what Pete Wilson, the Republican Party, did, and it turned them solidly blue, and it ultimately turned California solidly blue. We used to be one of the most, a big supporter of the Republican Party, and that's no longer the case. Republicans do like to point a finger at California and talk about how it's all doom and gloom here. And of course, if you live here, you realize that's not the case. I teach here at UCSD, which is, I think, 21% white. And it's a wonderfully vibrant place, and it's an exciting place, and it's a place filled with hope. And California remains this incredibly vibrant, dynamic place. And we are on the other side of this transition. So I think a lot of it just has to do with educating people that this transition is not going to lead to the demise of the United States. It's not going to lead to doom and gloom in the rest of the country. That actually, in fact, it's going to reinvigorate us as a society and as a country, and it's going to show the rest of the world, the rest of the white world, which will go through this transition, how you can actually manage this change and really truly become a multi-religious and multi-ethnic democracy. I end my book by reminding readers what our founding motto is. Our founding motto, before it was changed to "In God We Trust," our founding motto was "E pluribus unum," which means, of course, where out of many we become one. That is our motto. And so I think California actually has helped to show how it can be done. Texas is also minority white. Hawaii has always been minority white. Colorado is coming up behind us, in Arizona, New Mexico, and I would say that California is thriving. It has its problems, but it's thriving.
Well, I think there are no further questions, but Jake just raised his hand. So Jake, you're back on.
Thanks, Alan. I did have another question in the chat, and so that's why I raised my hand. I wanted to ask what you would think would happen if the Department of Justice, in fact, does indict and get convictions for sedition of Trump and the big lie people.
Wow.
Would that improve things or worsen things? Would the score go up because the checks and balances kicked in?
Yeah.
Or would it alienate, make more extreme the right wing?
That's a great question. I think it would just reinvigorate them. I'm a great believer that Trump is just a symptom. He's not the cause. That we have the structural conditions are in place for an ethnic entrepreneur like Trump to push a message of division and hatred. And if it wasn't Trump, it would be somebody else. And so, but Trump is incredibly charismatic. He's incredibly popular. And so if he were to be indicted, if he were to be punished, the propaganda machine would kick in, and this large percentage of Americans who are big supporters of Trump would just see this as more evidence of government overreach, of the rogue left, and even if Trump left the scene forever, that Trump 2.0 would emerge.
Barbara, we have another question from Faye Giersch.
Oh, hi. I just wondered where Jews fit into this animosity for the non-white minority.
So one of the unspoken stories, and I think it's still true. I looked at the data last year for the last time, but one of the unspoken stories is the biggest target of domestic terror over the last however many years has been Jews. And I don't know why that's not being reported or emphasized. But, you know, the white supremacist movement is also deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. And I would also add also kind of deeply sexist. It also tends to be, you know, a white male movement. But they do not believe that Jews should have any role in the running of the United States. And in fact, what, you know, they push various myths that Jews, you know, are already in control of America, and that needs to be stopped. So yeah, no, it's a huge issue.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Barbara. This has just been a wonderful hour with you, and we appreciate so much you're taking the time to be with us.
Yes, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.